Good morning, and thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be in Hebrews chapter 8. Have you ever noticed that shadows are kind of undependable? When you look at them, they look like one thing, but it turns out to be something different. When I was a teenager, I went to a workshop and we saw a shadow play. A shadow play is this huge screen where the actors are behind the screen. And the lights shining on the actors are reflected or distributed onto the screen. And so what you see is just an outline of the people who are acting behind the screen. This play was quite impressive to me and made an impact on me. And I thought to myself, someday I would like to do that play, maybe with a group of teenagers. Well, many years later, as a youth minister, I decided I would try it. So we got together a screen and we built this huge screen that went clear across the auditorium and got some big bright lights that we put up and set up behind the screen. And we began to act and to go through this play that we had written out on paper. It didn't work. The reason it didn't work was because the shadows were too far away or too close to the screen. If you didn't have two people that were the same distance from the screen, one looked like a giant and the other looked like a midget. There were such a wide variety of different problems that we ran into that made it very difficult. For instance, if a person's face was turned toward the screen, you couldn't tell much about the person at all. It was hard to describe on the screen different features. You had to be very clear on what you were doing. If you were hammering, you had to make it very obvious that that's what you were doing. All of these things were very difficult to portray on the screen. In Hebrews chapter 8, there is a description the author is making of the old law and the new law, or the new covenant, comparing the two, as well as the sanctuary, the high priest, the sacrifices, all of the things that were done of the old and the new. What was the difference? The description that's given in verse 5 says they serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and shadow of what is in heaven. All of these things were something to give us an idea of, but it wasn't a very clear image of what God had already made in heaven. He had planned this and begun it from the beginning of time. But the old covenant was flawed. It had failures and mistakes. Why? Because man was part of that covenant. He says that if you will follow me, you will be my children, and I will be your God. But the key word is if. If you follow me, you will be my children. What if they don't follow him? It says that God will turn his back on you. You see, the old covenant was built on obedience. It was built on observance of the old law. It was built on the fact that they had to be perfect, and when they weren't perfect, they had to have sacrifices for the forgiveness of their sins. The new covenant does not depend on us being perfect. And the new covenant does not depend on whether or not everything that we do as man is right or not, but rather it's built on the fact that God is perfect. Let's look at chapter 8 and see what it has to say to us. It says in verse 1, the point of what we are saying is this: we do have such a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, and who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle, set up by the Lord, not by man. Beginning right there, we see that there is a tabernacle or a sanctuary in heaven that is perfect. It's made by God. He himself made it perfect. There were tabernacles built here on this earth. As a matter of fact, in Exodus chapter 25, we see a description of what God had intended for Moses to create as his sanctuary. And we know that Moses did his best to follow those instructions and do what God intended for him to do. But it was made by man. It was imperfect. It had mistakes. And that was the least of the problems. There were other things that was even harder to duplicate and harder to make clear what God's intentions were. For instance, in verse 3 it says, "Every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices, and so it was necessary for this one also to have something to offer." See, the sacrifice itself had to be perfect, without blemish. When have you ever seen anything that was perfect, without blemish? We could look at it and we could find something that was wrong with it. We can't have a perfect sacrifice made by man, something created of this earth. No, it has to be of God. He is the only one, and the only ability lies with him to make something perfect. But that's not the only thing. He says in verse 4, "If he were on earth, he would not be a priest, for there are already men who offer the gifts prescribed by the law." You see, there were already priests who were creating and or offering sacrifices. But Jesus Christ, not of this earth, came to live, to die, to be raised again as our perfect sacrifice. The one performing the sacrificing and also the sacrifice itself were perfect because it was done by Jesus Christ. In verse 5 it says, "They serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and a shadow of what is in heaven. This is why Moses was warned when he was about to build the tabernacle. See to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain." God showed Moses what he wanted, told him in vivid description of what he wanted Moses to create. But yet it was still imperfect. It could never be perfect. God himself had already created the perfect sanctuary, the perfect tabernacle in heaven. In verse 6 it says, "But the ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he is mediator is superior to the old one, and it is founded on better promises." This covenant that Jesus created is so much better, so much superior to the old tabernacle as compared to the tabernacle that God built in heaven. This new covenant is perfect, without mistake. What could make it perfect? It still involves man. We are imperfect, and therefore the old covenant could not be perfect because man is imperfect. So, what could make this new one perfect? In verse 7 it says, "For if there had been nothing wrong with that first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. But God found fault with the people and said, 'The time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah.'" God had created a covenant with the house of Judah and Israel. He had created a covenant with them that was dependent on them being obedient, following God's will, doing what he had asked. But they could not do it. And this was the result in verse 9. "It will not be like the covenant I made with their forefathers when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they did not remain faithful to my covenant, and I turned away from them, declares the Lord." The old covenant was dependent on the followers to be perfect. They couldn't be. It was dependent on them following God and doing His will, and they did not do that perfectly. And because they did not do that perfectly, it says that God turned away from them. What would keep the new covenant from being like the old covenant? How can it be perfect? In verse 10, it says, "This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people." That sounds very similar to the first covenant. How is this different? In verse 11, "No longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, 'Know the Lord,' because they will all know me, from the least to the greatest." In the old law, there was only a few people who were able to read the law, and those teachers of the law would teach based on their understanding, based on their knowledge, their wisdom. They would teach the law of God to man. But in the new covenant, it says that Jesus died for us and gave us His Spirit when He left, that lives in us. When we become believers, we also have the Spirit living in us. And God speaks through that Spirit to us, teaches us, gives us instructions, leads us and guides us. That's one way that the new covenant is better, superior to the old covenant. What other way? It says in verse 12, "For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more." In the Old Testament, they had to be perfect. Under the old law, they couldn't make mistakes. And when they did, they had to be able to give a sacrifice that was pleasing to God to fulfill that difference. But under the new law, in the new covenant, the sacrifice has already been made. And God looks at us and He sees us as pure and holy. And He remembers our sins no more. We are made perfect in His eyes, not because of the things we've done, but because of what He has done for us, the sacrifices that were made for us. You see, the old covenant was imperfect because it involved man's willingness and ableness to be obedient. But the new covenant is based on God's grace, His mercy, His forgiveness, His love, His willingness to allow someone else, His own Son, to pay the price for us. And because that grace and that mercy was poured out on us, we have the ability to be called children of God. That's the promise of the new covenant. One that is not dependent on how good we are. One that is not dependent on how perfect we make ourselves, but rather on how perfect the sacrifice was, how perfect Jesus Christ was on our behalf. The last verse, in verse 13, it says, "By calling this covenant new, He has made the first one obsolete, and what is obsolete and aging will soon disappear." The old law was done away with, fulfilled by the new law. The new covenant replaced the old covenant. We now have a covenant of grace, a covenant of mercy, a covenant which no longer depends on how good we are, but rather on who Jesus Christ is and what He has done for us. We have a lot to celebrate. The old law was but a shadow. This new law, this new covenant, sheds a whole new light on things and makes things perfect. Not perfect because of us, but perfect because of him. All of these things are to bring us into a closer and more perfect relationship with God. It's his desire to have that relationship with us. And it's only because he is willing that we are able. I hope you will take these things to heart, and that this week you will think about the fact that Jesus Christ brought to us a new covenant that is perfect, that is without mistake, and that there is a place in heaven for us, a tabernacle that is without fault, and that someday we will enjoy that fellowship with God, with Jesus, that will not have the shadows, the indescription, but we will be with him face to face. And that's the fulfillment of this promise, this covenant. I hope you all have a wonderful week. May God bless you all.